There we go. Hello. So welcome to yes, sorry. Yes, it will finish before 2 p.m. because I've got a client at 2 p.m. But hello and welcome to the ADHD talk, treating kids and adults for ADHD. And um, you know, we are seeing a lot of ADHD at the moment, coming through with adults and kids. So I thought it'd be a good topic to start the year off. And if we can get it right as kinesiologists, I think we're in a really powerful position to help a lot of people, because what tends to happen is that people get diagnosed with ADHD, kids and adults, and then there's not a lot of support from there on actually, okay, what do we do now? How do we work with this um, other than medication? So I'm just doing a bit of a sound check. Can everyone hear me or see me okay? There's a chat box right there. So please let me know if you've got any other questions that come through, or you can talk. Thank you, everyone. Okay, so a little bit of background if you don't know me. My name is Emma, and I have been a kinesiologist for about 15, 16, nearly 17 years. I have a Bachelor of Health Science, so I did the full 5 years of kinesiology. I've been teaching other practitioners for many, many years, long over a decade. And I've run a kinesiology for kids course, which is coming up in January as well. So part of this, as always, is a little bit of promo for that. But I'll send an email about that later. Today really is just about ADHD. So I'm always a why person, and I always like to know why something's happening. And when we talk about ADHD, first off, what ADHD is, it's a problem. Well, it's a difficulty processing in the prefrontal cortex. So what that means is that this part of the brain right in front here, which has to do with our forward thinking, our decisions, every movement, every choice that we make internally, then goes to the prefrontal cortex, then to make the action forward. So difficulty processing in the prefrontal cortex means that we're either not receiving the messages from our body properly, or we're unable to act out those decisions that we've made internally. And what tends to happen is that it's like leaving a connection unmet in our brains. And that's a really simple way of putting it that I like to explain to people. It's that there's all these things firing, but nothing's really connecting and processing, or not enough is processing or connecting. So really, our job, I like to keep things really, really simple. Our job is to find out, is it a problem with receiving the information, or is it a problem with acting on the information? And that depends on which end of the brain we're working with. So you've got in a brain, and I really should have put slides together, I'm sorry, but bear with me while I talk about it instead. So we've got the back part of your brain, which is the limbic system. It's connected to our brain stem. So right back here. And this part of the brain receives sensory information from our body and the external world. It then sends information to our frontal lobes and our prefrontal cortex, which then says, okay, we know what to do here. We know the response here. We're engaged, we're active, and then here is what we want to do back. Here is our response back. So with all of the symptoms that present with ADHD, which is the lack of focus, the inability to be to concentrate, the impulsiveness, oh gosh, I should have written all of these down. The fidgeting, it's a sensory. I'm overloaded with sensory information most of the time, or I don't know how to respond to it. So when I look at ADHD, I'm really looking at, okay, does this come from trauma, from diet, from a nervous system response, or have we shut down our internal processing? So I'm going to go through all of these things. And again, it comes back to, are we not receiving information well, or are we not responding to information well? And I think we can really, really improve on all of that. But before I start, does anyone have any questions that they want to throw at me right away, or anything that they want to comment on? How many? I have quite a few of you here. There's, hello. Talina, is that you? Hello.
That's me.
Hello.
Hi.
So did you have a question to start with?
No,
Oh,
I
okay.
just jumped in, literally.
Okay, no problem. So if you have any questions, this is interactive. So please, please just throw them at me, because I can talk and I can get lost. So I like questions so I can stay focused. Funny that we're talking about ADHD. So I've seen hundreds and hundreds of kids with ADHD symptoms, with suspected ADHD, with diagnosis of ADHD. And to be really, really honest with you, there's a really small handful of those that actually have ADHD and need medication passed when we're done. Usually, there's a few little tweaks that we can do for diet, for movement, for emotional processing, that actually help all of those symptoms go away. And I think that's a really big thing that the healthcare system is missing, is like, what do we do once we're diagnosed, or when we have these symptoms? How do we actually approach it? And I think everybody has there you go. Everybody has a different way of looking at ADHD based on their profession, but as kinesiologists, we kind of get that all holistic view, which is really cool. Go we can go anywhere, really, and that's what I want to teach you today. So with the ones who aren't ADHD, could they actually be on the spectrum? I'm going to talk about that, but yes, possibly. ADHD is actually classified on the spectrum. So there are similarities there. There's also similarities with PTSD and retained reflexes, and ATNR reflex in particular. So they're the kind of things that we look at as well when it comes to the nervous system response and ADHD. But basically what I'm saying is that when we have a problem processing in that prefrontal cortex, we need to look at why. So firstly, I'm going to start with birth, because that's probably the easiest place to start. But the one thing that will shut down processing of the prefrontal cortex is stress, and is cortisol. So when we're born, we have the primitive reflexes. So if you don't know much about the primitive reflexes, they're our first movements in life, and we crawl down the birth canal, and that's our first, well, no, our first movement of the reflexes is in utero. But when we're starting to actually come out into the world and use them, so you can be, when we're talking about stress, you can go back to in utero and what the mother has gone through and all of those kind of things. I tend to find, though, there needs to be a confirmation once they're born. So it's not just that there's stress when the mother's pregnant and then that's it, they're screwed up for life. There needs to be confirmation then past that. And sometimes the mother's been under stress, which has made the birth difficult. And when you're talking to women about this and children about birth and things, we need to really make sure, and I see this a lot in my students, we need to really make sure that we're wording that right. And we're not saying this is your fault for being stressed. We're saying, stress can impact that. And then some kids, it may inhibit things, and some kids it doesn't. That's the thing. It really does depend on whether there's confirmation of that stress onwards, because the brain has so much development in that first 2 years that one moment of stress or 1 month of stress isn't going to create havoc for the whole brain development. The brain has a really incredible ability to go through things and accept things and change things, right? So we usually need that confirmation of stress. And by that confirmation of stress, I mean that stress happens again and again and again. in order for the brain to be really switched onto it. So, um, coming back to that, stress stays in the body because we don't understand it. There's a question that is left unanswered. So when something doesn't make sense, it's like a tab left open in our brain and in our body. And that's where tension comes from. And that's how I treat everything. It comes from what's the unanswered question that we have? What haven't we understood? What haven't we accepted? And those two questions. And that's how you feel safe again, is understanding things and having things expressed as well. So with ADHD, so we're coming back to now the primitive reflexes and that first movement of life. So what happens? Let me know if I'm talking too fast. I'm trying to like squeeze all of this into an hour. But when the reflexes first kind of bloom, I guess, is birth. And so you have that crawl down the birth canal, and that begins the ATNR and a spinal galant reflex. I have a reflexes course, or there is many out there if you want to know more about this. And then you come out of the birth canal and you take that big deep breath, right? And that's our Moro reflex. And that Moro reflex is the big breath in, and that's that startle reflex that we see in babies. And it's taking in the world. And then we find mum with our hands in our mouth, and we feel safe again. And that Moro comes back in. And we relax and we settle. So what tends to happen is if that Moro is too big, or if there's trauma at that point, the limbic system switches on too much. And that's why I'm coming back to that. So when the limbic system is switched on too much, or when the limbic system is switched on, it's like a ratio, right? In a way, when the limbic system is switched on, the prefrontal cortex switches off because you want to react rather than think about things too much and decide too much. And that's our survival instinct. So if we are running from the brainstem to the limbic system, then they're reactions and they're impulses rather than thinking and deciding things. So the first movements of life are always reaction based, and we get that feedback and we say, okay, are we safe or not? So that's where those responses are set up in the body. So something happens and a sensory information comes in, and we have that response, the initial response to it. And then we will either decide if we're safe or not. And if we're not safe, then that creates a tension point in the body, and we react in survival from that point. And that becomes a pattern in our nervous system where this isn't safe, this isn't safe, this isn't safe. And that's what I mean by that confirmation, is that we need, it's not just once it happens and then we decide we're unsafe. It's got to happen over and over and over again. So we decide that this combination of sensory information that comes in, so neurons that fire together stay together, right? So there's a particular combination of sensory information that comes in, and then we decide whether that's safe or not. And so what happens is that if we decide that we're safe, if we don't need to react, or if we understand things, then it comes through to our frontal lobe and our prefrontal cortex, and we say, okay, we understand what's happening here. We know the response that we need. And then it either goes back through the limbic system and says, okay, we need to respond with reaction, or it goes to the prefrontal cortex where it says, we're safe enough that we can decide what's happening here, and we can decide what our next response is going to be. So let me say that again. So we have sensory information come in. We decide, are we safe or not? So the limbic system decides whether we're going to switch on or not. Am I aware that this has happened before? Am I not? Does this feel scary? Yeah, all of that sensory information. And then it sends that information to the frontal cortex. So the higher parts of the brain, that higher functioning, that's when we talk about lower brain and higher brain. Yeah, top and bottom processing. So you can look into all of that with brain function as well. But you've got the bottom processing, and then it goes to the top, and the top then decides, okay, I know what to do here. I feel safe enough that I can create movement and decision, and this is what we're going to do. Or it says, I don't understand. I don't feel safe. Can you react? Now in ADHD, this part becomes overwhelmed. And it means that we're not reading that information correctly, or we've decided that we're unsafe, and so the information doesn't even really come in and process properly through that prefrontal cortex. And so when we're working with ADHD, you have to first work with the limbic system and make sure that is settled. And then you work with the prefrontal cortex, which is our brain processing. So you have to work with both. Always. Let me know if I'm making sense or if you have any questions so far or comments. No, not so far. So what we look at as kinesiologists is we go, okay, is the limbic system switched on too much? Or are we not processing? So if the limbic system is switched on too much, does that come from trauma? Does it come from primitive reflexes being too active or uninhibited? So it means that they haven't made that progression from reflexes to actual movements we can control. So primitive reflexes are our preliminary movements. So they teach our body how to move. And if the reflexes are on too much, then we don't fully get control of our body and our movements, because the reflexes are always going rather than us having full control over our movements. So is the limbic system too active? What's the trauma? Is it birth? Is it something emotional? Is it something that's happened that we don't understand around us? Or is it something that's happened to us? So what's the shock? So we decide that the limbic system's switched on too much, usually by symptoms. There's going to be a lot of tension in the body. You're going to see meltdowns that last more than 20 minutes, usually. It's a high degree of fidgetiness. You can also go back through the history and you can say, okay, was there birth trauma? Was there instability in the first, particularly 2 years of life? Was there a lot of conflict in the first 2 years of life in your environment? Or in the case of adult ADHD, majority is trauma-based. I'll just put that out there. And you can, if you have a different opinion, let me know. But usually I've found is that ADHD symptoms are actually overlap with PTSD. And there is quite a bit of literature on that if you want to Google it. The overlap between PTSD and ADHD. So the literature says, are they coincidental that they just tend to, people who've been through trauma tend to have ADHD? I tend to find, though, that the symptoms of the ADHD will lessen once you work through the trauma. Because when you're in survival, you can't think. You react. You are just taking in the sensory information around you and trying to respond and react to that, rather than consciously making decisions and creating and things like that. So with ADHD, they say one of the symptoms is that inability to focus and take in information and break down information and have that detailed response to things. Now that's all, sorry, I was just reading a question, so I got distracted, but all signs of prefrontal cortex processing. So our prefrontal cortex, again, is our decision making. It's, if you think of it like being able to take a concept and breaking it down into details. So would being born with hip issues be classed as trauma? I would say it's more to do with the movements, not being not being able to move through things. So create movements. And so it's more hip issues. I would look at more that frontal lobe processing and development rather than limbic system. So this is where we kind of go, all right, is it limbic system or frontal lobe thing? So the frontal lobe is where information goes and we make our reactions and decisions based on things that we've seen before, that we know what's happening, we know the pattern, we know what our response usually is, or the people around us, what their response is, so that we've taken that in as like a sponge, and those things fire together and they say, okay, we've seen this response before, so that's how I'm going to respond. So that all comes from that higher center of the brain. So when we're working with the limbic system, we're doing a lot of body work, nervous system calming. However you want to work as a kinesiologist, just work on calming that nervous system down. And the big thing with ADHD is we want to get right is the sleep, making sure that we're not mouth breathing in our sleep, which also means that we want to make sure that our tonsils are not enlarged as well. So tonsils being enlarged means that we're mouth breathing at night. Usually we're not sleeping. Therefore, we're overloaded all the time. So what happens in sleep is that these glial cells come in and they essentially sweep out our neurons. So it's our brain goes into that deep processing mode and makes all those connections that it needs to make, those unopened tabs throughout the day. It says, okay, we need those open still, or we can close those now. So the brain essentially does a sweep out at night. If you want me to go a little bit more technical, please let me know, but I just find that keeping things simple tends to work better when we've got a little bit of time. So if you're not getting that deep sleep, you're not sweeping out your brain, you're not clearing it out, you're not processing deeply. If you've seen that movie Inside Out, it's a really great representation when they're organizing all of those spheres in the library. And that's what happens at night. They do that clear out and organization. So we're looking at the nervous system response. The other thing that we look at a lot, and that can be either triggering the limbic system, usually it's more inhibiting that frontal cortex processing. So when things are not processing, when we can't make sense of things and we don't understand things, when there's too much sensory information. So if you can think of sensory information coming in, it's like something lights up. And then once we understand it, or once we get feedback, then we have that dopamine response, and the dopamine closes it again. That's how I like to visualize it anyway. It's that opening when we receive information, and then we should close it. Open, close, open, close. What happens in ADHD is that it opens, but it doesn't close. And that's what the medications do. The medications make all of this faster. So that's why they help. But we're not actually a lot of the time processing things. Yes, in a way, but it's not like a deep processing. It's just stimulating that processing. Simulating, sorry, is the better simulating is the word I was looking for. Simulating that processing. So it closes the tabs, but are we actually really understanding and processing and storing things? So the other side that then we can look at is, okay, once we've relaxed that nervous system, once we've made the body relax, once we work through the reflexes, again, reflexes are a huge part of ADHD. So the ATNR reflex, sorry, I'll come back to that because I missed that part. The ATNR reflex is our reflex where we turn our head and our body goes with us. And it stops a baby from rolling over. It helps them find and grab and start processing the difference between near and far, where I am in space compared to what I'm reaching for, that hand-eye coordination. So essentially, it's that interaction between the world and myself. Can I reach the world? Does the world respond to me? But what happens when the ATNR doesn't inhibit, so we don't break up that head and body. So, the people who drive a car and they look and their whole body goes with them. Yeah, that's an active ATNR reflex. So what we want to do is we want to be able to have separate control of our body and our head. So if you can think of in a classroom environment, that means that you can't focus on two different things at once. So breaking ATNR means that I can now focus on two different things at once. So that's the development phase that goes with it. So I'm looking over here, but my body's doing something different over here, and I can have that two separate focuses. But what happens with an active ATNR is that where our eyes travel, our whole body travels, and therefore our focus travels. So if you've got a child so for instance, I had a child in a few weeks ago, and he was getting into trouble all the time from talking to his friends. But what it was that when he went from focusing to the board to writing down, by the time he had stopped from looking up to looking down, he'd lost his focus. And so finding that that focus on the same line as where his eyes were, so next to him, yeah, so he had trouble up and down, which is the TLR reflex, but don't worry about that. He had trouble with this tracking up and down. And so he would be able to focus on one up or down, but then he'd lose his train of thought from the top to the bottom. So what he would do is he'd look to his friend and ask his friend, right? So it's the same level. He didn't have to go up and down. So the poor kid, and this is what's happening in schools, the poor kids are coping in their way of how to process information, but it's being seen as behavioral. And I didn't really properly address that at the beginning. So much of the behavior issues that we see in school is actually difficulty processing. And we're being diagnosed really quickly without formal diagnosis. It's a checklist. It's just okay, often let's just see if the medication works. And if it does, then we'll assume that ADHD is there, which is really hard in real life because the appointments between the pediatrician appointment like that you can get are so far apart. So you've left with the families bumbling as to what actually is working, what's not, and all that kind of stuff. And if you can think of a classroom, it's actually quite a sensory overloaded place and a survival stimulating place, because you're on your own at school. You're away from your safe place. You may not have found your place of belonging yet. And in order to feel safe, we need a sense of belonging. So if at school, if we don't feel like we belong, then we don't feel safe. And what happens when we don't feel safe is our limbic system switches on. So how many of these kids are being diagnosed when they're just trying to cope with surviving school and trying to understand what people's reactions are? No one's giving them feedback on things. There's a lot of information, but are we actually really learning? That's one other thing, is that We've had to become so focused um, on exams and tests and things that it becomes information without actually learning and curiosity. And so I know that a lot of teachers are trying to change things, but for a lot of kids, there's a lot of information coming in and not a lot of time to really figure it out and learn it and have that feedback and have that conversation with people, particularly in big classrooms that we have nowadays. So we have, a new group of 30 people that we need to meet every year and see now where we belong. And within that, we're meant to also feel safe enough to learn. But what happens if we don't feel safe? We can't focus. We can't make decisions. We can't, we don't filter out other sounds, other noises, and everything. We can't sit still. We have to be on edge all of the time. We don't sleep well. We have these internal thoughts going on, but no real, especially as a child, no real understanding of what I'm actually thinking or feeling because no one's there seeing it. And so we wonder why all of these kids are being diagnosed with ADHD. It's because they don't feel safe at school a lot of the time. So our job as kinesiologists is to hopefully help that child find safety within school or space to process or a voice even to say, okay, this is what I'm not feeling safe about. And that's up to you as the professional is to, okay, be able to lead that path there. But if we want the limbic system to calm down, we need to feel safe. The other thing that we didn't talk about is that there is in the limbic system an area which is called the pons, and the pons is like a sensory filter. So I'm going to be really simplistic with this again. And when we're in survival mode, that pons opens up. So you're taking in a lot more sensory information because we need to decide whether our environment is safe or not. When we're relaxed, that pons closes. So essentially, when you're stressed out, you're hearing more, you're feeling more, you're seeing more, and then your brain has to try and process all of that information. When you feel safe, you naturally filter things out. So for instance, there might be a sound in the background or the aircon might be on a bit too much, but we're feeling calm, we're feeling relaxed, and it's all good, right? So we actually don't really take note of it. It's not an information that comes into our higher centers in order to be processed. So somebody's asked as well, hey Camilla, someone's asked, do we separate ADD from ADHD? Look, I tend to kind of put it all in the same thing. ADHD is hyperactivity with it. ADD is just the attention deficit. They're just symptom complexes which stem from the same thing. But inattention comes from, look, there's a couple of different things here. So there are kids who are dreamers and they have this incredible ability to daydream and they see things and they feel things rather than using that left side to analyze things and get down deep and gritty with things. So often what I see in these daydreaming kids is that the teacher's talking to them, but they're interpreting things in images. And so they look like they're daydreaming, and they might be because they'll take a piece of information and then their brain will process it by putting it into images. Taking what I've heard and what I've felt, and now I'm going to process it myself and visualize it and daydream about it. And this is an incredible skill. We want to really nurture that, but it's not nurtured enough, and they're seen as daydreaming. And so they're seen as inattentive. But actually what they're doing is it's like translating it language-wise. So they're translating what they've heard and what they've seen written, and they're translating it into their own visual processing. So they're putting images to it, or a feeling or a sense or a concept around it. And so they're kind of off doing this with that information. But because they're off doing that, they might miss another bit of information, or the teacher may single them out, and now all of a sudden I'm on survival mode. Yeah. And that really sucks because these kids then aren't using their natural language, and they've got to try and fit in with the language of school. And that school, it only lasts a few years of someone's life. And, you've found that, okay, now I've squashed all these parts of myself into a way that I have to respond, and they lose track of that natural nature. So again, in adults with ADHD, have they actually got ADHD, or have they lost track with their nature of being able to interpret images and interpret life through the right brain, which is your visualization and your bigger, wider concepts of things and relationships, and things in a grander scheme. And then we're coming back now. Sorry if I'm jumping a little bit here, but so you've got the limbic system, which we've spoken about a lot. And one of the things from the reflexes is if we haven't developed and been able to trust our own movements to negotiate us through life, then we don't use that prefrontal cortex, and we don't use the frontal lobes, and we don't use the left and right hemispheres of the brain. So the left and right hemispheres have to talk to each other, and they get, we live off that right brain really for the first 7 years of our life, and then the strengthening of the corpus callosum in between happens around 7. So that's our neural highway really between that left and right brain. And the left side of the brain is our detail. It breaks things down. It says, okay, this is, if the right brain says, this is our whole picture, the left brain says, okay, these are the details. And so we tend to be more dominant in the right or the left brain, but they do have to communicate with each other in order to get the whole picture. And so you'll see that really clearly in kids, with ADHD, is that you want to do an eye tracking exercise. And this is really, really simple. So you move the left and then you track all the way to the right and back again. And you'll be able to see if they're jumping. And essentially you can see where they're missing information. So they're actually jumping from one thing to another rather than creating a full picture of understanding and processing. And that's one really simple thing that I do in clinic to teach kids and parents how we're progressing, really, is that smooth movement. It should be smooth movement left and right. Remember that movement goes opposite. So left side of the body, right side of the brain, right side of the body controls the left side of the brain. But it doesn't really matter. You don't need to go too technical in that with this purpose. It's more about seeing whether it's moving across, that information is moving backwards and forwards through the brain smoothly or not. So one thing that I do to help that is all of those left and right side brain gym exercises. So one simple one is hand on your, so I do this over 7 or 8 because it's more finite. Hand on your nose, hand on your ear, and the hand on the ear goes over, and then you switch it. Switch it. Yeah, and even there you could see that I cheated. So you got to keep your levels, keep your level, because what people will tend to do is try and use one side of the brain by turning their head. Yeah. And then hand and touching the knee as well is another brain gym exercise. There's a few of them. If you Google brain gym exercises, you can tend to come up with a few. What that one was a figure 8. So you're going across the midline. That's really what you're looking for, is that smooth movement across the midline. And that means that you're processing information. When you're not processing information, again, there are those tabs left open in your brain. So that's unprocessed information. essentially. And if you really just visualize unprocessed information in your brain, it's messy in there. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of brain fog. There's a lot of different things catching your attention, but is it all actually making sense? And when things get confusing in life, we tend to feel anxious. And so often there's anxiety that comes with a lack of processing. I go into this a lot more into the course, but essentially that's what you really need to know is that when things aren't connecting, then it's an unopened tab or it's left open, and that can cause a lot of anxiety because there's a lot going on that we're not really understanding. And that's why we get a lot of meltdowns, because that meltdown actually gives us that final dopamine release to let go. So when we're looking at that frontal lobe and that prefrontal cortex processing, we're looking at, is it movement based? Have we not had the movements that we've needed? Or is it actually a feeling or a relationship or something happened that hasn't been understood or spoken? So the left side of the brain is where our speech comes from. So we want to make sure that what we're feeling and seeing matches what we know and what we're talking about or what's been said to us. So quite often I found in ADHD is that they live in an environment where what is being said to them, what's being responded with, isn't the same as what they feel, or what they feel hasn't been seen and heard and therefore responded to. And so just having that ability to talk about what I feel creates that connection. And so then they're able to understand and process and put things together. Do your clients like to work towards getting off medication? Some do, some don't. Most of the time they do, because they're seeing a holistic health practitioner. Some kids actually find that they have more confidence on it. Usually I find that that's because they've been told a lot of the time that they're doing things wrong, or they've created a sense of I'm not smart, I'm in trouble all of the time. So the medication suppresses all of that symptoms enough for them to feel like, okay, now I have a sense of belonging, or I can feel like I have that feedback from the teacher, which is positive, and now I belong and I feel safe. And so eventually, though, there's always a space where they need to get off it. Medications will often come with a suppression of appetite, which can be problematic in itself. Yeah, so many boys lose weight as well. So yes, so girls lose weight on it, yes. So that's why it can be addictive, particularly for that older teenage adulthood. There is a whole industry, I guess, based off Dex addiction. And they tend to lose a lot of weight on it. That's a whole other issue. Again, then we're looking at trauma based, because why do they need to change their person so much in order to fit in order to feel safe? So you're looking for the trauma there as well. The other thing I will mention before we leave is diet. So I'm sure if you've kind of done your study and your A&P study, that you've heard of the Krebs cycle. So the Krebs cycle is our energy cycle. It's how we create energy from our nutrients internally. And to do that, you actually need nutrition, right? You need your magnesium and C's and B's. But what happens is that if you're not having enough nutrition, then the Krebs cycle has nothing to work off. And so you end up running on cortisol. Cortisol kicks off the limbic system. So a lot of the kids that I'm seeing are actually malnutritioned, and that's why they have the ADHD symptoms. They're in survival because they're tired and fatigued, and they're running off cortisol because they're not getting the nutrition that they need, and they're going through blood sugar spikes all day long. particularly if they've had like cereal for breakfast or no protein. So protein is our source of magnesium, our B vitamins. So even if you're vegetarian, you need that full protein source. So your quinoa, brown rice with sesame seeds, your legumes. The complete sources of protein are quinoa and brown rice and sesame seeds, but the human body does like to run off meat, so you need to be really cautious to replace that if you don't, if you're not eating it. But so many kids don't have protein to begin with in the day, or they don't eat at all. And so their blood sugar, if they've had sugar, spikes, and then by the time they get to school, it's crashed again. Or they um, or they're going up and down all day long, and so they're tired and they're high and tired and they're high, all that kind of thing. So if you have protein, it levels it out. And many behavioral issues I've seen in boys in particular, it will be fixed, all of a sudden miraculously disappear once they start having protein, a lot more protein. Hey Camilla.
It's okay to speak there. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Very, very amazing information. So from what you think, everything that you're saying, like everything that keeps repeating in my head is like, what comes first? The chicken or the egg? It's like the people are born, like kids are born with something special because it's meant to be, then it's not accepted. Therefore, you know, like is the trauma causing it, or is this causing trauma because the trauma of feeling like belong, like this is what I have experienced and remembering now that I being diagnosed with ADD, like for me the trauma of no acceptance comes after. But I think there's a big discussion. You may have your take on it, but it's really that's one thing that I wanted to say. And another is, when you said like your tabs are open, you very sensitive to the environment. uh it made me think of like, oh, people who are empaths, and also some people are very like, what would actually determine if someone is very auditory or kinesthetic, because I find like I'm not very sensitive auditory, but a lot of people are. So I don't know if that has a strong correlation with ADHD, that you have seen, that people tend to be kinesthetic or tend to be um, auditory or not. So I think that, yeah, there's two things that made me think. Do you have anything to say on this?
Thank you. Thank you. They're really great questions on comments. And I think the really important thing there is that we don't just think that we're going to have one session with somebody. And that's our opinion and that's it. These things tend to be layered, like you said. And you might find that in one session, it's presenting more the emotional side, like you said, the belonging, or the next session then might be that this is just the way that I am, and we need to find that part and honor that part again. And often with ADHD, I'm working with kids for months and months, every 2 weeks, and so I'm getting to know them really well. And each session is another part of getting to know another aspect of them, and adults as well. So like you said, there isn't just one, this is what it is. It's usually, like you said, like, okay, that's then created that part, and that part's led to that part. And we might never really know what came first. But yeah, again, always rebook for that exact reason. It's because another layer will be revealed itself. Um,
Are you upfront and saying, because people might ask like how long it takes, how long it may take. So how do you approach that?
um, I have a pretty black standard thing of, okay, once you with me, I'm with you on the journey now. Like that's it. Like there's really no end or start date. We'll work intensively on an issue until it goes away. Usually no less than 5 sessions on that, but I don't have a hard and fast rule either. You know, I'm very much set the expectation to be, you know, you might not see me for a few months, but then the moment something else pops up in life that you need help with, I'm your person to call. You know, and often I'll get that from kids is they ask to come and see me again, or their parents say, okay, this has popped up again. You know, life is life, things happen and things get messy. And so having that person there who's always a safe place to come to is so important. And I really honor that space, honor that for my clients as well. So again, even for yourself as kinesiologist, don't put the pressure on yourself to have it all sorted within a certain amount of time. You know, it's just it's usually okay, this is, you know, we'll do this and then we'll see how it goes. And some kids, when they have that survival on, they don't actually want to let go of it. You know, letting go of survival, and adults in particular, if you've been through trauma or have a lot of feeling associated with things, it can take a while to feel safe to be vulnerable and safe to let go. And so you don't want to rush that and you don't want to place pressure on it. But what I do want to see is improvement. And if there's no improvement within 3 sessions, then I'm doing something wrong. There should be a fair bit of improvement once you do the diet, the nervous system relaxation, and the brain function things. You can do all of that within 1 session. And all of my sessions are that combination of nervous system work, emotion, and finding an issue and working through it. So you said that no less than 5 sessions. Would you close session and then bring up? I usually just say, you know, how things going and see whether the client comes back to what was or whether they've got a new thing that's popped up. So I leave that in their court. And I'm always asking, you know, how's that going? What's happening there? So we do want to go back and review. But you don't want to get stuck on something because, you know, like I said before, there are layers to things. Been talking for a long time now. I know that's a ton of information, but that's why we record it, right? Thank you so much for coming. Did anyone have any questions before we finish up, or any comments on what I've said, or arguments even? Let me know. From anyone? No. Oh, you guys are the quietest bunch I've had in a while. The course begins on the 29th of January. So I'll send that out with the recording here. And how I calm the nervous system, I do lots of body work. Sorry, I tapped the microphone and I help them understand what's going on. But again, it's all in the course, exactly how I work. But
Just one question
yeah.
about the course. Like, I don't think I have an interest in working with kids, but with adults with ADHD, like it still covers quite a bit, like the reflexes and everything. And
Yeah. Well, the primitive reflex course, you might be better for you because that that is just the reflexes. Although the Kin for Kids course, the beautiful thing about it is that it goes through each development phase. So anytime that you work with the inner child, you're working with the kids. And having that understanding of the development through the years and the internal processes, and the spiritual needs and the emotional needs throughout childhood, that's everything that we cover in the course as well. So it does help you when you're working with adults as well. Yeah.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Thank you. But thank you, everybody. You can always find me on the practitioner table or my Emma Sternberg Kinesiology. But yeah, again, thank you all so much for turning up today. And you'll see me now if it's the recording. But yeah, thank you. Bye, guys.